So welcome everybody back to this panel discussion, and I'm very honored to give the floor to the chairs, Anna Giuliano and Eduardo Franco. Please go ahead.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for many, and no longer good morning, or perhaps good morning to a few. It's Anna Giuliano's and my privilege to have this panel discussion now. The session we're going to be covering mostly the situation on the supply landscape of HPV vaccination, current scenario and future perspective. We have two speakers. Let me start without further ado, move on to introducing someone who needs no introduction, in fact, and who's been a major stakeholder in this whole scenario of cervical cancer elimination, and that's Dr. Tania Cernuschi. And she's a World Health Organization official. She leads the WHO EPI work on access to vaccine supply. She has over 15 years experience in design and management of development programs to enhance access to health technologies in resource-constrained settings. She has worked with Gavi, Undesa, the Italian government, UNICEF, and many different NGOs. She is, as background, she is the development economist and the public health specialist by training. Dr. Cernuschi, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Eduardo, and nice to see many faces. Good afternoon, good evening to all. I will start by recapping a little bit what happened on the demand side of the HPV vaccine market in the past years. This was partly covered, I think, in the previous discussions this morning, but essentially we've had a very sharp increase in demand for HPV vaccine, which is clearly a positive news, something we all would want to see. And that was led by a few factors that I'd like to point out. One was a shift from pilots to national programs, particularly for the Gavi eligible countries, which led to a sharp increase. We also had a recommendation by WHO to immunize a multi-age cohort when introducing HPV vaccine, as well as an interest in high-income countries to vaccinate adolescent girls, in addition to adolescent girls, also boys and adults. And all, these are three, among other factors that really had an important impact on the shape of demand, which is clearly, one of the two dimensions we want to keep in mind when we think of markets, not just the supply side. In addition to that, there's been, as you know, an adoption of a resolution by member states for a global strategy towards elimination of cervical cancer this year. And we expect that looking forward, that may increase demand further. So the graph on the right shows with the red line what the WHO elimination scenario, which essentially as a difference of every country introducing and every country reaching a higher coverage for a programmatic dose requirement of 160 million doses per year by 2030. So this is on the demand side. As I said, this is all positive so far. If you move on to the next slide, what we see on the supply side is that despite the investments, the supply side has not been able to keep up with demand. So it's fallen short of demand. I believe it's starting around 17, 18 that we've seen supply constraint, despite, as I said, investments by companies. In particular, we know that there were two suppliers in the market, but there's been an overriding country preference for one product, and that, of course, has had an influence on the investments by the competitor, which even considered market exit, and therefore an impact overall on the supply available to all countries. The good news is that, as you all already know, there is a new market player that joined since late last year, that is Innovax, and there are therefore in total 3 manufacturers right now, with 2, 4, and 9-valent products. And 2 are selling internationally. Innovax has applied for WHO pre-qualification, which is under consideration at the moment. So is for the moment focused on their national Chinese market. And there's also a rich pipeline, which I believe Peter will talk more about. But just another positive sign here to say there's a lot of developments in process. 3 companies with 2 and 4-valent vaccines that are in phase 3. And then we know also of at least 2 technology transfer, which are looked at in particular as prospects also for lower pricing. Right now on the pricing side, there's a big range from a Gavi price around $4 to high income pricing that can be as high as 178. This is what is reported to WHO. Of course, we don't have full visibility on every single country, but it shows just a very big price range. We've seen some developments, but I think that the bottom line message there is that we probably won't see much downward pressure on price until the investments have been recouped, until there's more competition, and until those tech transfers are completed. Therefore, I think it's important to remember that, particularly for middle-income countries where budget may be more constrained, and there's little support from external donors, pricing can be considered still one of the obstacles that they may face. On the next slide, a short-term perspective, what this means. We think that basically, and Paul Bloom has presented some of this in the morning, in the past 18 months, countries have ended up calibrating their demands, in part because of the projected vaccine supply shortages, in part and for COVID as well. So we've seen countries excluding immunization, immunizing multi-age cohorts and postponement of introduction. I think because of this recalibration of demand, which in itself is obviously not what we would want to see, but because of that recalibration, we essentially have done an analysis showing that we have, in principle, sufficient supply to meet routine demands, so with no multi-age cohorts campaigns. As of today already, in practice, we still see countries unable to serve their programs. And that's due to a mismatch between supply and demand. And why is this happening? That is for various reasons. One is that there's again strong country preferences for a product versus another, which may mean that countries are ready to wait for the product they prefer that may not be available. There's of course suppliers allocation decisions based on strategic interests that may lead to some countries going short of having what they need. And then of course we may also see some mismatch as countries delay their programs for COVID, or as they start to plan to catch up and may need a relatively important amount of doses, which is sort of unpredicted at a specific time to catch up cohorts they haven't vaccinated. So I think the takeaway message here is we need supply and demand to be closely managed in the short run, even though there is in principle sufficient supply to meet the routine needs. On the next slide, we look forward to the future. So say around 2024, we think there would be a sufficient increase in production capacity, thanks to the investments by the current producers, but also the new pipeline products coming online. Of course, these are estimates. We all need to work towards getting those green dots realized. There's a range depending on various factors, and particularly on countries and it following through their plans to companies having success in development and investment efforts. Aside for that, in the longer term, aside for the investments by companies, we also need to keep an eye on the country's plans, so that they actually do follow through their commitment to the elimination, despite indeed the COVID challenge. And again, a point to make around the country acceptance of the different vaccine products, because the pipeline is rich, but products needs to be taken up by countries for those to be useful. I think I have one slide only left. If you move on, please, that looks at the next steps from our perspective. In short, we need to focus on optimizing access in the short run, and in scaling up availability through 2024. And this requires, first of all, acquiring visibility on the COVID impact on both the demand side. So again, how are countries playing out those programs, and including catch up, and what would be the programmatic dose requirements needed so that we can have visibility and inform suppliers' investments. But also the impact on the supply side, both of the pandemic and the production of COVID-19 vaccines. We need to get more visibility there. There are a series of risks that have been flagged on the input side, as well as on the outputs, supply chains related issues, and as well as process related matters. And we need to have visibility on that on the supply side as well. We need to advocate once again for country consideration, due consideration based on scientific evidence that is available of all the quality assured HPV vaccines. Right now, there's a sense that more can maybe be done on that front, and we're eager to engage to provide more information for owned and evidence-based decision making. And then we need to keep our focus on time to registration and pre-qualification of pipeline manufacturers, as well as provide all information needed to current suppliers. And of course, I believe there's been discussions on the one-dose schedule, for instance, but continue to look from our perspective into optimized schedules based on evidence, and that will also help increase supply flexibility, depending, of course, on what the evidence says. The last point to say, we've been convening, unfortunately, due to COVID, in some sort of virtual and alternative fashion, a global dialogue with multilateral discussions with partners, with countries, with regulators and industry, with really the aim of reducing the supply risks and really trying to contribute to the alignment of supply and demand. And we think we will have to continue doing this dialogue and facilitate it, given the prospects I've just shared. You will find, I think, as of next week, a global market study on HPV that provides much more detail than what I could share here today, available to you. This is an update to a publication we've been putting out for the past couple of years, and we hope that's helpful to your work and to the community working on cervical cancer. I'll stop there, Eduardo, and happy to take any questions.
Tania, thank you so much. We're going to quickly move on to Peter Dull, and then I think convene the full discussion for this panel. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter Dull, who is the Deputy Director for Integrated Clinical Vaccine Development within the Global Health Division at the Gates Foundation. And many of you know him very well, so I don't want to dwell too much on all of the work that he does at the Gates Foundation, but just to quickly say that he did join the Gates in 2014 after working for 10 years at Novartis and has very extensive experience with vaccine development. So Peter?
Thanks, Anna. Can someone pull up the slides? Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and I'm really sorry I haven't been able to join for more of this interesting discussion. There's a lot of really important topics between the time zones and all the COVID life that many of us are living. I just haven't been able to make space, but thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the product development pipeline. So before I dive in, I think this has been a very trying time for a lot of us. I think, and no exceptions at the Gates Foundation. I think one learning, I think, and that has come to pass, I think, on our side very early in this adventure back in March, we had a sort of a coming together of our leadership with our with Trevor Mundell, sort of putting the charge out to all of us that, seeing this impending pandemic and really many of it spooled out in Seattle in the U.S. Very early, and we saw a lot of the trouble there. He put a challenge down that he believed, and I think it may come to pass that despite the crisis we're living in, this is an opportunity of vast breadth, and he challenged that at the end of this that we can make a 10-year advancement in many of our global health objectives, and I think a number of those we're seeing even in the last few weeks with the advancement of RNA vaccines, these platform vaccines that we would not have really, it would have been 3, 5, 7 years before some of these have really played out. So as we look across not just RNA vaccines, advectored vaccines, some of these nanoparticle produced vaccines that are mounted on top of these VLPs. I think not just HPV, but malaria, TB, other vaccine opportunities. I think the technologies are going to be really interesting. Therapeutic vaccines for HPV, maybe we should, again, think about some opportunities there of what we're learning. So I think there are going to be some opportunities to harvest positive things out of what we're living through, although it's been a very difficult and continues to be a pretty difficult time for, I think, all of us. So just want to say that, trying to put a little bit of a silver lining on this darkness that has been across many of us over the last 8-9 months. So next slide. I just want to do a quick, not going to dwell on this, but I mean, these are the things that the foundation has focused on. Tania touched on a couple of these things that I'm not going to talk more about. It's really, we think that single dose data will become more interesting this year. So a number of studies that have been germinating for the last 3 or 4 years are coming to fruition. I hope for next summer to have a more fruitful conversation about, is there a there? Because studies in Kenya, more data coming from India, from the IARC study coming together, more durability studies as well for 10-year follow-up data after a single dose of Gardasil. Data like that, I think, is going to come together, and I hope we can have a more, with this group on this call and other groups and other fora around what this really means. Is there something that we can be doing here? So stay tuned for that. Foundation works also with the introductions, but what I'm going to talk about today really is around the low-cost HPV supply and some of the support that we've been giving, and just a landscape of what's been happening, both more broadly and in the context of COVID-19. So next slide, please. So this next slide is a little bit depressing because I think I've been showing this slide for the last 2 or 3 years, and there's just been modest tweaks to it. I am a little bit disappointed that we can't get, besides China, and I'll talk about China in a minute, we really haven't pulled others into this space at all, as far as additional we have a monopoly essentially. This is a profitable vaccine. This is a technology that is fairly mature. It is a hard vaccine to make, but I think I'm kind of just a little surprised we haven't been able to convince others to engage here. We're in the foundation, we primarily focus on developing country vaccine manufacturers, where we provide technical and financial support to try to ease their way not just into domestic licensure in China and India, but really so we can rapidly move those vaccines into a global market. So the ones that we have been focusing on over the last 3 years, or 5 years, I guess, are Innovax, Xeron or Walvax, and then the Serum Institute. I'll talk more about Innovax and Walvax in the next couple of slides, but just a pause quickly on the Serum Institute. So Serum Institute, as we know, mega supplier for global vaccines. I hear this a lot. I don't know if it's true, but 2/3 of the children in the world receive a vaccine out of Pune from the Serum Institute. I think it's probably true. I keep saying it. It is a massive supplier for vaccines globally. They have a quadrivalent vaccine that is now advanced into phase 3 studies. It's based on the Hensenula yeast platform. It's a platform they know well. They use it for hepatitis B vaccines. So we have relative confidence that this one is going to be good. We will see. They are talking 50 to 70 million doses per year. They finished their phase 2 studies toward the end of last year. They initiated their phase 3 studies in February of this year, right in the middle of COVID. They started enrollment. Enrollment went fine. They locked down. They are now restarted enrollment again on a study of around 2,000, 3,000 for a non-inferiority study versus Gardasil 4. So that's the advantage of being in India. You can do an immunologic non-inferiority study versus Gardasil. We'll talk about China in a second and why that pipeline looks rich, but it's slow. And for regulatory reasons of what they need to do to demonstrate efficacy in China. So in India, this will be much quicker. They're starting later, but you can see on this slide an estimated pre-qualification date of 2023 for the quadrivalent. Still on target for that, despite some delays in their phase 3 study. Butantan, I know, Tania, I love those tech transfer dots all over the world. Those look great. It is not easy. So they look great on a map, but Butantan's been trying to tech transfer this thing for a decade. I don't know what is going on there. You really need deep engagement with the parent organization, i.e. Merck, to make these things move quickly. So we can see Innovax is tech transferring to Thailand. I see a dot on there for Russia. I'm sure we'll have one for BioVac in South Africa. But these tech transfers, you need the technical competence in the geography where you're receiving them, and these vaccines are not necessarily easy. So some vaccines are easy. I will say that. These are not easy. So that's why, in some ways we are in the place we are, because the manufacturing complexity of these vaccines are not easy. So Butantan still working on scaling and manufacturing. I think when I check in with them in the next 2 years, I hear that pretty much every 2 years. So I'm not sure when that will be. But the point on Butantan, though, is it's going to be a supplier for Brazil. It may be a supplier for PAHO. It's not a Gavi supplier. So we don't have a supply crisis in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere. We have a supply crisis in Gavi countries. So it's not going to solve that. SK also has a quadrivalent. They've completed the study at ICDDRB in Bangladesh. I do not know the results of that. I do not know their path toward licensure or their prospects for being a global supplier. But there is yet another study that is out there that is being run. That's in a baculovirus insect cell backbone. So again, not your lowest cost platform. So I'm a little less optimistic that it may be a global supplier, even if we find a tech transfer recipient for that product. But that is at least evidence that it can be done if and when that study reads out. So that's the global landscape. Now I want to double click into China. The next slide, I think, is the platform for or the list of very fertile product development activities across China. This is a sketch from just in April of 2019, and you can see that there are a number of suppliers. You know, in part, I think you can see, and you've probably heard how much money is being made in the private market in China, and the large catch-up opportunity in China, where there is a lot of, it's almost a fashion symbol, I guess, to be a 27-year-old woman and get an HPV vaccine. These are not impactful interventions, as we know, but they are, it is a pull to bring more suppliers into this. We have focused, as I said, on just a couple of these, because these are the companies that have indicated an interest in going global and have sized their fermenters such that they can deliver on 5, 10, 20, even 30 million doses a year. And that is Innovax and Walvax. So just a quick update on those two suppliers. Next slide, I think, just is a click on the 2020 timelines. And so you can see broadly, all the red and the green lines are moving to the right. We now have multiple 9-valent vaccines that are in at least the clinic running phase 1 studies. We now have even 9-valent vaccines that are in phase 3 studies. And just to pause on the implications, I said this earlier, but the issue we have in China is that they need efficacy, and the regulatory agency, as opposed to the WHO guidance to all regulators, which suggests that immunologic non-inferiority is sufficient for licensure, that has not been picked up by the NMPA in China. So they are insisting on a clinical endpoint of SIN2+, and that adds 5 years to the timeline of your study. So most of these studies for the 9-valents are 2027, 2028. That's a long time away. So we are living in a 2 4-valent world plus Merck for a number of years. I'm not giving up. I think we can still have some conversations with the Chinese regulators and maybe pull them into this, but those studies have now initiated with a clinical endpoint with 6 to 10 to 15,000 subjects with a clinical endpoint. But that's sort of the state of play with the regulatory environment in China. So with regard to Zero and Walvax, so they have completed that. They have a bivalent vaccine that we had supported funding. They had met their phase 3 criteria, submitted their application to the NMPA. We would anticipate that if the review goes positively, they would have licensure by next year, and they would have pre-qualification by the following year. As I see at the bottom, they have also initiated their phase 1/2 studies in the 9-valent vaccine. We are actually co-funding some of the work in the 9-valent, but it is a reliable platform, Pichia pastoris, to manufacture that vaccine. Next slide is the Innovax story. So Innovax is the shining star here. They do have a licensed vaccine now in China as of December. They did submit this vaccine for WHO pre-qualification toward the end of Q1. This has been COVID decimated. The ability to do inspections in China right now, to move it through the PQ process, have been troubling. I guess you need to prioritize COVID when you need to prioritize COVID, but we were hoping to have an accelerated pre-qualification even toward the end of this year. I don't know when it's going to happen. It's probably in the first half of next year. I'm hopeful we'll have pre-qualification and then move that as a true global supplier in the developing world. Price point, I think that's on the Gavi website. $3 a dose is sort of the indicative price point for a bivalent vaccine. So this is truly a step change in the cost. So for middle income or for Gavi graduating, Gavi transitioning countries, this may be something that is going to be of higher interest. Going to be interesting to see how this works over the next few years as to how much this vaccine gets taken up, but it is a very good vaccine. Next slide, just want to show one data slide because I love data, is just the data from their phase 3 studies. So this, it was published last year, but again, I think it's indicative of both a highly immunogenic and efficacious vaccine. The blue line shows you the accumulation of SIN 2-3 cases in their per protocol population on the left, and you can see the red line is flat along the bottom. No cases in the control group, accumulation cases in the placebo group, and on the right is it's a persistent infection endpoint. So again, a 45-to-1 split in persistent infection in the per protocol population. This is a good vaccine. It should work. So that's really what I wanted to say real quick. I think, again, more broadly, it's coming. They're coming. I wish they were coming quicker. I think it's a technology that can be achieved in developing country vaccine manufacturers. And I think, I think we're going to get there, and I think we're going to be in a space where we are going to have a lot of vaccine, and we can think more creatively about how we use that vaccine. It's not going to be tomorrow, and we can start to think about more what we can do in an era when we have lots of low-cost HPV prophylactic vaccines. And I think this group is a good group to sort of strategize around, whether it's older age groups, gender neutral. We'll get there. We're not there yet, but I think I look forward to getting there at some point. So thanks for your time, and happy to take questions.
Great, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Tania. We were given instructions to keep this to 30 minutes, and so I'm going to ask the organizers, can we allow a few questions in this session now?
Yes, please.
Anna, can I come in? Narendra Arora.
Please.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. That was very exciting and also encouraging. Can you tell us what is the global HPV requirement if only women are to be given, or females, and if both men and women? And what is the current gap? Because the way you were telling us about the Chinese, the total dose capacity, you were mentioning 20, 30, 40 million doses per annum, which may not even complete the Chinese requirement. And even the Indian Serum Institute is also, you mentioned 50 to 100 million probably. So can you comment on this gap and the current requirement? Over. Thank you.
Narendra, maybe that's best if Tania manages that. I think that's more on the supply. So I mean, I'll say just one thing as far as the China. I mean, it is not on the EPI. There is not an imminent plan for it to be on the EPI. So although the birth cohort in China, is 14,
18
16,
million. 18 million.
I was going to.
And Indian is 26 million.
That is not the population that's going to be targeted. Right now, it is the private market that is consuming it. We hope to get it on the EPI, but there is a fungible giant population of catch-up in China that would be absorbing most of that. I don't know, Tania, do you want to talk about the global gap, or can I hand that to you?
Yes, happy to help there. Narendra, thanks for the question. So I think you can go back to the very first slide I presented if you want the estimates. And again, there's going to be figures published next week for your perusal, but they estimate for current doses being used in programs is, I think, 60 million, if I'm correct. And there's, I mean, our sense is this is going to get to 140 by 2030, based on the current basic scenario. If you look at a more aggressive scenario for the cervical cancer elimination, I've shown the slides there that will get us even farther up. The gap is right now, as I said, I think. So the gap right now for us is not there, in the sense that in principle you have sufficient supply to meet demand if countries don't undertake catch-up campaigns, and if we don't have a further increase in boys and adults vaccination. But as I said, it's a tight supply availability that requires careful matching. Of course, we have to see how demand develops. What we had estimated is that of the current use for programs, there's about 10 million doses right now that are going for boys, to give you a sense. And of course, it will, it will develop. We have to see how that develops farther. Right now, we don't have indications, I understand, and probably also due to the current pandemic situation, but we don't have indications from high-income countries of further plans to introduce for boys or adults. We know of a few countries, I believe that's France, Netherlands, Portugal, Sweden, that are looking at introduction this year. And that's an important factor to keep in mind. I hope that helps, and happy to take this also bilaterally.
I just add, I mean, I would just say that it's a bit of an art, and Tania said this, it's a bit of an artificial non-gap. I mean, we have toggled back on what we should be doing with the max and the catch-ups. So whatever we say that we're in an okay space, it's fake. We made it okay because we asked countries not to introduce in these max that we were hoping to do. So
yes, and that's a very good point to stress, that indeed there is also a SAGE recommendation out. I did not clarify this. I'm not sure if it came through in the morning, but that was put out last year. That is indeed for countries, not only for high-income countries right now, to avoid gender-neutral and adult programs, but also, as Peter is saying, not to for multi-age cohorts to pause for the moment until there's supply, and this is happening, which of course is not what we would want to see for reaching our elimination goals.
We have a couple of questions from Sharon, and Sharon, I don't know if you want me to read them, or would you like to come online and ask them yourselves? Okay, so what Sharon has asked is related to COVID-19. So the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine is also being manufactured in India. And the question is, will that affect the supply of the Indian HPV vaccine? And then related, what do we know about Innovax GSK9 valent vaccine, and whether they're aiming for a one-dose regimen or not?
Thank you.
I can give a go. I mean, first for Serum Institute, I mean, obviously that Oxford vaccine is being tech transferred and manufactured, if successful in efficacy studies, knock on wood, after immunobridging would be manufactured in the Q1, Q2 of this coming year. So the quadrivalent HPV vaccine, we hope for licensure next year, 2022, a year and a half from now. So they got massive fill finish capacity. I don't think they will intersect at all. And I would say more broadly, I don't know if this was a question, Tania, that was, I don't hear, and maybe Anna might know, or whether Merck or others are being somehow impacted by COVID from the existing supply. I don't hear concerns around further supply constrictions of the existing vaccines at all. Others might know more.
Yeah.
As far as
Peter, I have not heard of any additional supply restrictions given COVID from the Merck side.
Yeah.
Well, you've got the Merck representative, Miriam, in the audience, Miriam Rauschenbach. She can address this question, I think.
I can confirm what Anna says. We do not have any further constraints due to COVID, so that's good.
Yeah.
So maybe just to give a piece of information there, that UNICEF is going to be the procurement coordinator for the COVAX facility, and together with PAHO Revolving Fund, they've just issued a request for proposal for COVID-19 vaccines to be supplied through the facility, and they will be collecting information as part of the request for proposal on potential impacts on supply of any other antigen. So if there is any concern, that will come through in the coming weeks as information from that front.
And just quickly on the other question around the GSK Innovax adjuvanted 9-valent vaccine. At this point, I think it's we'll see over the next few years, I guess, how the one dose, including this summer, the data come forth. But I think it's very early on that vaccine. But there's no reason conceptually why an adjuvanted 9-valent would not have the same capability to be a one dose. But I don't think it's hasn't been necessarily put into the plans yet. It's very early days. I think really that's a 2027, 2028 timeline product as well. So lots going to happen between now and then.
Okay.